In this video, you'll learn how to transform your semi-structured interviews from this to this. If you keep watching, you will get the 4 methods that you can use in your interviews to make them better in terms of the quality of the empirical data and make them a little more interesting for both you and your participants. Okay, so the umbrella term for the methods I'm going to share with you today is prompts. And there are many different types of prompts, but the general purpose of them is to get more data and more nuanced and complex data out of your interviews. And that's really what we're aiming for when we're doing semi-structured interviews. I have a bunch more videos on semi-structured interviews, so go check them out after this video. I'll link them in the description. What's also really great about these prompts is that they'll give your participants more of an active role, which can also make them feel more in control and make them more comfortable with the interview. Another common characteristic of these prompts is that it involves concrete materials that your participants can interact with. And without further ado, let's go on to the 4 prompts that I'm going to share with you today. So the first one is the S model. And the S model is a very simple way of visualizing a timeline for you and your participants. And that's why it also makes it really useful in connection with grand tour questions. And if you don't know what that is, then check out this video right here. To do the S model, you simply draw an S on a piece of paper, which represents a timeline. This timeline can represent a whole life, a year, a day, or even an hour, depending on what makes sense for your research. And of course, let your participant know what timeline this represents. Then you hand over the pen to your participants, who then can describe what happens through this timeline. So if you asked about what they did yesterday, you'll ask, what did you do yesterday? And then make them draw little crosses and notes along the way. So this very simple prompt is genius for multiple reasons. First, having a physical timeline to think through will help your participant recall more events, and therefore you'll get a more detailed timeline. Also, if they suddenly remember, oh, between this and this I actually did this, then they can go back and plot it in between the 2 events. Allowing for more data like this is really beneficial when we want to have a comprehensive understanding of someone's experiences. Second, having this physical manifestation of a timeline helps create a shared reference point for your participant and you can much more easily follow the timeline when you have it right there in front of you. Third, it helps you as a researcher to remember what you can ask your participant more about, instead of having to frantically recall everything they said. Instead, you can look at the S and ask more about the aspects that you want to know more about. You can, for instance, ask, you mentioned that you called your mom right before work. Do you feel comfortable sharing more about what you talked about? Now again, these questions of course depends on what you're researching, but I hope you get what I mean. Okay, so for the second prompt, we're going to stay in the realm of pen and paper. For this prompt, you're going to ask your participant how they experience a situation, a person, themselves, their relationships, or whatever you find relevant for your research. Make sure that you have pen and pencils in different colors for your participant and assure them that you are not judging them on their ability to draw. Then you can ask them to describe what they're drawing and ask more about the elements you find interesting. So let's say your participants are people who have just moved out from their parents' homes and into their first place on their own. And you want to know how they make this first place feel like home. So you ask them to draw their idea of what home looks like. So while they draw, you can ask them to share what they're thinking. And after they're done, you might notice that they have drawn a lot of plants. And that's your opportunity to say, wait, I noticed you drew a lot of plants. Can you share more about what plants mean to you? Or if they used a specific color a lot, you can ask what that specific color means to them. As we know, a picture says more than 1,000 words, so why don't utilize it when it's appropriate? This prompt can also make it easier for your participants to talk about more sensitive topics, because the drawing to a degree takes the subject from something in here to out here. In that sense, the drawing becomes the object of the conversation, and it creates a little emotional distance from what you're talking about. The third prompt might be an obvious one, but I wanted to include it in here because sometimes we simply forget the obvious. And that is to have your participant use or do whatever your research is about. As an example, I did my bachelor thesis on Tinder, and I had my participants show me how they use the app, and while they did, I would ask them questions about what they were thinking or feeling. Or if you're researching something about grocery shopping, you go grocery shopping with them and interview them about their thought processes or whatever you find relevant. The point is to have your participants actually do what you're researching. The advantage of this is, of course, to have your participants in the moment reactions instead of them having to think back about how they felt or what they might have thought at some point in the past. This will ultimately give you better data to work with because your participants are sharing what they are experiencing in the moment. So in your research process, ask yourself if you were going to interview your participants about something that they might as well do while you interview them. So moving on to the last prompt. And this one requires a little more preparation, but I promise you it's worth it because this one will really get your participants talking. For this prompt called vignettes, you write relevant hypothetical scenarios on pieces of paper before the interview. Then at the interview, you present one scenario at a time and ask your participant what they think or feel about the given scenario. In some cases, slightly provocative scenarios is an advantage because they'll solicit answers with a lot of opinions and perspectives. That is amazing for you as a researcher because the answers will often contain more of your participants' worldview than the answers to normal interview questions will. So doing this provocative version of the vignette prompt will get your participants to put words to things that are deeply ingrained in them and therefore normally are hard to verbalize. In other cases, rather than being provocative, you can present scenarios about a little more sensitive topics. This is valuable if you're researching something that is hard for your participants to talk about. By having your participants commenting on fictional stories or scenarios that share some of the characteristics but are not identical with your participants' stories, you'll get them to indirectly comment on their own experiences. Again, it can be easier for your participants to talk about something out here or someone else's story, so it's a great way also to make them feel more comfortable. Now, I know you might be really excited to use these prompts, and I hope that you'll integrate them into your interviews. However, as always, it's vital that we are aware of the purpose with each method we use. So only use these prompts if you have evaluated that they'll bring value to your research. Don't use them just to use them. It was perfect the first time. I'll do it one more time. That was good, right?